An evening and unspoken truths. Mrs. Holloway walked into the restaurant, just like any ordinary woman. Nothing particularly special about her except for her long coat, perfectly fitting shoes, and a light hat that covered her gray hair. She wasn't a wealthy woman, nor someone with influence in society. But despite that, she possessed a unique strength that not everyone could recognize. Patience and calmness of someone who had lived through much. What she desired in life was simple. A peaceful evening, a good meal, and the feeling of being treated like anyone else in society. But that evening, things didn't go as she expected. When she entered the upscale restaurant, no one paid attention. The other diners seemed to be lost in their own world, but Mrs. Holloway felt the chill. Not from the air, but from the coldness others directed toward her. No one greeted her. The servers didn't step forward to welcome her and guide her to a table. It was a clear sense of neglect, though not outwardly obvious. In fact, there was something very odd about the situation. Mrs. Holloway had been to this restaurant many times before, and every time she was met with a warm welcome. The young staff always greeted her with warmth, friendliness, and respect. But today everything was different. Today she felt like she had become invisible. Her son, Elijah, stood by her, immediately noticing what was happening. Elijah was a strong man, with a deep sense of vision, always able to see through complicated situations. He was never quick to anger when facing any problem. However, when confronted with this kind of discrimination, he didn't immediately react. He understood that discrimination wasn't always blatant. Sometimes it's hidden in the little details we fail to notice. Elijah decided to remain silent for a moment and observe the staff's behavior. And as expected, after a short while, a young server named Kevin approached and greeted Mrs. Holloway with reluctance, as though she were an unwanted guest. "Hello, please follow me," Kevin said, his voice dry and devoid of emotion. Mrs. Holloway remained calm. She didn't say anything, just followed Kevin to a table by the window. As they sat down, she felt all eyes on her, but not in a way that was welcoming. It was a silent, cold gaze, as if she didn't belong in this place. Elijah watched everything closely. He looked at the side glances and furtive looks from the younger diners around them. Some lowered their heads to avoid looking at her. Elijah felt anger rising in him, but he didn't express it right away. Instead, he chose to let things unfold naturally. Mrs. Holloway, although silent, could feel the injustice. Sometimes discrimination doesn't manifest in overt actions, but in the small, unnoticed things, details that, if we're not careful, we can easily overlook. But for Mrs. Holloway, those were like small stones piling up to form an invisible wall, separating her from the people around her. And then, when everything became painfully clear, Elijah decided to speak up. He didn't shout, didn't criticize or blame immediately. He simply asked a gentle question that changed the atmosphere of the restaurant. "Excuse me, but is my mother being ignored here?" Elijah asked, looking directly at Kevin and the others around them. His words were like a light tap on the shoulder, causing the room to snap to attention. The staff began to realize that they had done something wrong. Elijah's question wasn't a criticism or condemnation, but a gentle reminder. Kevin, the server who had served Mrs. Holloway, nervously replied, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize she had been sitting here for a while." But Mrs. Holloway simply smiled, saying nothing more. She didn't need an apology anymore. What she needed was acknowledgement and respect from those around her. The lesson to be learned from this story is an awakening. We often don't realize that, in our society, there are subtle forms of discrimination, small acts of neglect that we don't recognize. But if we open our eyes and see these things, we can change not only for ourselves but also for others. Mrs. Holloway's story isn't just about discrimination, but about the strength of silence and letting the truth reveal itself. But what can we do to prevent these kinds of subtle discriminations from continuing? The simple answer is awareness. Awareness of what's happening around us and not being afraid to speak up when we see injustice, no matter how small. The silent struggle of everyday life after that evening at the restaurant. Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. Mrs. Holloway had always lived through challenges, But seeing this new wave of subtle prejudice made him more determined to understand the forces at work. In society, the situation with the restaurant wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a broader issue. The ways in which people's differences can lead to invisible barriers, even when those barriers aren't immediately visible to everyone. As a young man, Elijah had spent most of his life studying human behavior, especially how people from different backgrounds navigated the same spaces. He had always found it fascinating how people, regardless of their wealth, race, or status, could still be treated differently based on something as subtle as their appearance or the way they carried themselves. But the way people interacted with his mother that evening, it left a mark on him. It wasn't just about the mistreatment she faced. It was the silence that surrounded it. He remembered another time when something similar happened, many years ago. Elijah had been much younger then, just starting high school. It was during the first parent-teacher conference he had attended with Mrs. Holloway. Her presence, calm and dignified, made her stand out among the other parents. She wasn't the loudest or most vocal in the room, but her quiet confidence spoke volumes. When the teacher called her name, the other parents exchanged glances. Elijah, who had never paid attention to these things before, was suddenly aware of how they looked at his mother, judging her not for who she was, but for what they assumed her to be. There was no overt hostility, but the coldness in their gestures and the way they looked past her made it clear. She was an outsider in a room that was supposed to be welcoming. The teacher, a middle-aged man who had been friendly to everyone else, treated her with a slight air of condescension. "I believe your son is doing well, but there's always room for improvement," he said, glancing at the notes in front of him. His tone was polite but impersonal, and Elijah immediately sensed that something wasn't quite right. There was no effort to make Mrs. Holloway feel comfortable, no attempt to engage with her as a fellow parent. It was as if her presence was more of a formality than anything else. As the conversation continued, Elijah felt the frustration rising in him, but he kept his emotions in check. He had grown up learning the art of patience from his mother. Her ability to endure, to not react to the small, daily injustices that most people never even noticed, was something that had always struck him as both admirable and deeply tragic. How many times had she been dismissed, underestimated, or ignored in the course of her life? But Elijah knew that it wasn't just his mother who faced this challenge. It was something that countless people in society dealt with daily. Whether it was a young person in a job interview, an elderly person in a healthcare setting, or a person of a different racial background trying to break into a predominantly homogeneous environment, there were so many instances where people were silently rejected, even if no one said a word. After that parent-teacher conference, Elijah made a vow. He would be the voice that would challenge these subtle but harmful practices. And not just for his mother, but for all those who faced similar struggles in silence. In the years that followed, Elijah became more active in his community. He volunteered, led initiatives, and became a voice for the voiceless. But no matter how hard he worked, he always remembered that quiet, dismissive treatment his mother had endured. He couldn't forget how, in those moments, the power of silence had done just as much harm as any loud words ever could. One day, while speaking at a community event about inequality and the ways in which people from marginalized groups were often treated differently, Elijah told a story that stuck with everyone in the room. He spoke of a time when his mother had taken him to a local store when he was just a child. They had walked in, both excited to pick out a gift for his birthday, but the moment they entered, the store owner, a man in his late 50s, immediately followed them around. His eyes never left them as they browsed the shelves. At first, Elijah didn't notice. He was too busy picking out a toy he had been dreaming about for weeks. But Mrs. Holloway, ever perceptive, noticed immediately. Without saying a word, she quietly walked up to the counter and began to ask the owner a simple question about the store's products. The store owner's response was stiff and cold. "Oh, we have a lot of options over here," he said, gesturing mechanically. But Mrs. Holloway didn't flinch. She continued asking questions with the same polite demeanor she always had. Finally, the moment of realization came when the store owner asked, "Are you sure you can afford any of this?" The words were out before he could stop them, and the harshness of the question struck both of them like a punch in the gut. The implication was clear. The owner had assumed that, because of her appearance, Mrs. Holloway wasn't the type of person who could afford the goods in his store. It was a moment that stuck with Elijah, and to this day it still makes him angry when he thinks about it. But what stayed with him even more than the store owner's rudeness was his mother's reaction. She simply smiled and asked for help finding the item she wanted. It wasn't about the price of the item, it wasn't about the assumption the owner had made. It was about the way his mother, with quiet dignity, had handled the situation. She hadn't let that moment define her. She had stood her ground, silently but firmly. The lesson from this section is this: people will often judge based on what they see, not on who you truly are. The small gestures, the things we overlook, speak volumes about how we treat each other. It's in the subtle acts of discrimination, in the unspoken attitudes and biases, that we find the true reflection of our society. And like Elijah, we must ask ourselves, are we letting these things pass unnoticed, or are we going to change the way we see each other? The power of standing up, whether through words or quiet resilience, is in recognizing when these things happen and taking the courage to speak up, act, or simply be the example of grace and dignity in the face of bias. And just like Elijah and his mother, we all have the capacity to turn these moments of injustice into lessons of empowerment. Transforming silence into action. The days after Elijah's reflection on the incident at the store and his mother's unflinching grace, he found himself pondering the core message that had always been embedded in the way Mrs. Holloway had raised him. Don't let their silence be your silence. She had always taught him that the world might not always notice or understand your struggles, but that didn't mean you had to carry those struggles alone or in silence. And, importantly, it didn't mean that you couldn't change things. In the weeks that followed, Elijah spent time reflecting on how societal issues, subtle prejudices, and biases were often silenced. They didn't have the loud, dramatic presence that we associate with injustice, but their impact was just as profound. And that realization led him to a critical question. How can we break the silence and create real change in a world where people are often too afraid, too uncertain, or too conditioned to speak up? Elijah began to delve deeper into this question, attending community meetings, reading books on social change, and even interviewing people who had faced various forms of discrimination or bias throughout their lives. What he discovered was both eye-opening and heartbreaking, that the barriers people face, whether they be racial, economic, or even based on something as seemingly trivial as accent or appearance, are often built on years of silent assumptions, quiet discrimination, and unspoken rules. These things don't make the headlines, but they contribute to a system that leaves many people behind. But that's where the power of action comes into play. One particular afternoon, Elijah was sitting with a group of young people from his community. They had all gathered together to discuss the challenges they faced in finding jobs, getting an education, or even being taken seriously in the workplace. The conversation had been heavy at times, filled with frustration and anger at the system that seemed to disregard their potential. But there was also a palpable sense of hope. These were people who, despite the odds stacked against them, refused to accept the status quo, and they were ready to do something about it. It was in one of these meetings that Elijah was struck by a powerful thought. It wasn't enough to just point out the problems. Change could only come when people began to act, when they took their voices from the quiet spaces of their lives and put them into the world. Whether that meant running for office, challenging bias in the workplace, or simply standing up when they saw something wrong, the only way to break the silence was to become an active participant in changing the system. A key part of this realization for Elijah came when he met a young woman named Carla. She was a college student, and like so many others, she had faced subtle but very real discrimination based on her background. As she shared her story of struggling to secure a job after graduation, despite having excellent qualifications, Elijah saw a fire in her that he hadn't noticed in other people. Carla wasn't just upset about the situation. She was determined to make it right, not just for herself, but for everyone who came after her. What we need, Carla said, her voice filled with passion, is a shift in the way people think. We need to stop accepting that the way things are is the way things have to be. We can create spaces where we lift each other up, where we stop letting these silent biases decide our futures. Her words hit Elijah like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about confronting prejudice when it was loud and obvious. This was about confronting it when it was subtle, when it was silent. This was about confronting it within ourselves. The more Elijah thought about Carla's words, the more he realized that breaking the silence didn't always have to be a loud protest or a public stand. It could be a quiet, deliberate action. It could be the decision to offer someone a seat at the table, to give a voice to those who have been silenced for too long. It could be in the small, everyday choices we make to actively combat the prejudices we encounter, or to speak up when we witness injustice, even in its most muted forms. But for real change to take place, there was something that needed to happen first. People needed to realize their power. It wasn't just about calling out what was wrong. It was about embracing what was right. It was about supporting each other in moments when the world seemed to be against them. It was about turning the silence of those who had been overlooked into a chorus of voices that couldn't be ignored. A turning point came when Elijah was invited to speak at a leadership summit. As he stood at the podium looking out at the crowd, he felt a sense of responsibility. Responsibility not just to share his thoughts but to challenge the people in the audience to act. This wasn't just about talking about issues. It was about finding the courage to confront them head-on. "I know what it feels like to be invisible," Elijah began, his voice steady. "To stand in a room and feel like no one sees you. To feel like you're just another face in the crowd. But I also know what it feels like when you start speaking up, when you start doing something, anything to make a difference." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The world doesn't need more people talking about change. The world needs people who are willing to make change happen. And with that, he launched into a passionate call to action. To fight not just against the overt forms of discrimination but the quiet, subtle biases that permeate everyday life. To break the silence. To stand tall in the face of injustice. And to take action, no matter how small, every single day. Elijah's words resonated with the audience, but more importantly, they resonated with him. In that moment, he realized that the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The true challenge wasn't just in breaking the silence of society. It was in keeping the conversation going, in turning those small acts of resistance into a movement that could change the world. In the end, the lesson that Elijah learned was simple. Real change doesn't always come from grand gestures. It comes from the small moments, the times when we choose to act, to speak up, and to never allow the silence to dictate our fate. It comes when we understand that the power to change the world lies within each of us. Whether it's through big actions or small steps, the important thing is to keep moving forward, to keep challenging the status quo, and to never forget the power of breaking the silence. And so, as the story of Elijah continues, so too does the movement to change the world, one quiet, powerful action at a time. And perhaps, just perhaps, in the silence that often surrounds us, we can hear the whispers of those who are finally speaking out, finally being heard. This is the essence of transformation. Not just waiting for the world to change, but being the catalyst for change yourself. Breaking the silence isn't just about fighting prejudice. It's about embracing the power of our collective voices and understanding that every small step counts. The work isn't easy, but the reward is profound. And it all begins with one voice and then another and another. Would you like to dive deeper into how we can continue breaking the silence and ensuring lasting change? Now I want to leave you with a challenge. Look at the world around you. Notice the silence, the subtle biases, the unspoken prejudices that go unnoticed. And then, think about how you can break that silence, how you can be the one to speak up, to act, and to make a difference. It doesn't have to be a grand gesture. It can be a simple conversation, a choice to support someone who's been overlooked, or standing up when you see something wrong, no matter how small. But the key is to act. Don't let the silence hold you back from speaking out, from creating change, from standing in solidarity with those who need it most. We all have the power to shape the world around us. So, here's your challenge. Today, tomorrow, and every day after, find one moment where you can break the silence. Take that step. Share your voice. Because together, we can create a world where everyone's voice is heard, where no one has to stand in silence anymore. Are you ready to take action? Let's do this together.